My name is Daniel Reeves, and I have been a backcountry ranger in Yellowstone National Park for 7 years. Before this posting, I worked land management in Montana for 3 years, and before that, I studied environmental science at a state university where my professors taught me that the natural world operates according to principles that are knowable, measurable, and consistent. I believed that completely when I graduated. I believe it somewhat less completely now. The restricted area I patrol is designated internally as the Thermal Variance Corridor. It does not appear by that name on any public map. Visitors who approach its boundaries encounter standard closure signage citing ongoing geological research. The signage is accurate in the way that a description of a house as a structure containing rooms is accurate, true as far as it goes, and stopping well short of the full picture. I want to tell you about the thing the area does when we leave, but to explain that I need to first explain what the area is, because the moving is not the strangest part. The moving is just the part that finally made me understand that the other things I had been observing and explaining away were not separate incidents requiring separate explanations. They were all the same thing, seen from different angles. The Thermal Variance Corridor covers roughly 1,800 acres in a section of the park that sits above an unusually active portion of the hydrothermal system. The ground there behaves differently than the surrounding terrain, not dramatically, not in ways that would alarm a casual observer or produce the kind of visible activity that draws tourists to the geyser basins. The heat expresses itself quietly here. Warm ground in winter, soil temperatures that run consistently above what the ambient air temperature would predict, a faint mineral smell on still days that the wind carries away before most people notice it. The corridor has been closed to public access since 1976. The closure paperwork cites thermal instability and ongoing monitoring requirements. Both of those things are true. Neither of them is the reason the closure has never been lifted in nearly 50 years. I know this because of the boundary records. Every restricted zone in the park has a survey file, boundary coordinates, marker positions, documentation of any changes to the closure area over time, standard administrative record keeping. The survey file for the Thermal Variance Corridor runs to several hundred pages and goes back to the original 1976 closure. I requested access to the full file in my second year on this posting because I had noticed something during my routine marker checks, and I wanted to understand whether what I was seeing was new or whether it had been seen before. It had been seen before, continuously in documented form for 46 years. The boundary of the Thermal Variance Corridor, when measured by consistent survey methodology, is larger every time it is measured than it was the time before, not by large amounts. The expansion averages somewhere between 8 and 15 acres per year, depending on which section of the boundary you are measuring and what season the survey is conducted in. In some years, the rate is lower. It has never, in 46 years of records, been 0. When I did the arithmetic on the cumulative total, the corridor is approximately 430 acres larger today than it was at the time of the original closure survey. 430 acres of ground that was outside the boundary and is now inside it. I brought this to my supervisor in my second year, framing it as a question about the geological explanation. She listened carefully and then told me that the thermal substrate expansion was a known and documented phenomenon, that the park's geology division was aware of it and monitored it as part of their ongoing assessment of hydrothermal activity in the region, and that the boundary markers were updated on a regular survey cycle to reflect current conditions. I asked her what was causing the expansion. She said the hydrothermal system. I asked what specifically about the hydrothermal system produced consistent lateral expansion of affected terrain at the surface level without any corresponding increase in visible thermal features such as vents, pools, or ground fracturing. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said that those were good questions for the geology division and suggested I submit a research inquiry through the appropriate channel. I submitted the inquiry. I received a response 3 weeks later that used the phrase ongoing assessment 4 times in 2 paragraphs and answered none of my specific questions. I stopped asking through official channels and started reading the survey file more carefully. Here's what the survey file contains if you read all of it instead of stopping at the summary pages. In 1987, a ranger named Gustafson conducted a winter boundary survey and noted that 17 markers in the southern section were found inside the current boundary line rather than on it. He documented this as marker drift, recommended reinstallation, and noted in his personal remarks column that the displacement was inconsistent with frost heave or soil movement, as the markers had shifted inward rather than in the random directions that frost displacement would predict. In 1994, a different ranger documented the same phenomenon in the western section. 12 markers inside the line, displacement inward. Personal remarks column noted that the markers had been correctly positioned at the previous survey 18 months earlier and that the ground surrounding them showed no evidence of the disturbance that would accompany soil-based movement of that magnitude. In 2003, a survey team of 3 rangers documented inward displacement of markers across all 4 boundary sections simultaneously, 29 markers total. The team leader's remarks in the file are longer than any other entry I found and contain a sentence I have returned to many times. She wrote, "The displacement pattern is consistent across sections that were surveyed by different teams on different dates, which suggests the movement is not the result of individual survey error, but of a systematic change in the position of the boundary itself." She was the last ranger to use the phrase "the boundary itself" in official documentation. After her entry, the file returns to the language of marker drift and survey correction, the comfortable phrasing that describes the symptom without naming what is producing it. I found her name in the personnel records. She retired in 2011 after 14 years in the park. I wrote her a letter. She wrote back. Her letter was 2 pages. I'm not going to reproduce it here because it was a private correspondence and she trusted me with it. What I will tell you is that she confirmed what I had interpreted from her 1994 survey remarks, that she had believed then and continued to believe that what the boundary records documented was not geological expansion in any conventional sense of that phrase. She wrote that she had spent years trying to find a framework for what she had observed and that the closest she had come was this: the corridor is not expanding outward. Something inside it is expanding, and what we measure as the boundary moving is actually the edge of that something pushing against the limit of the space it currently occupies. She wrote that she did not know what that something was. She wrote that in 14 years of working the corridor, she had never directly observed anything she could point to and say, that is the thing. She had only ever observed its boundary, its edge, the place where whatever was inside met the terrain outside, and the terrain outside gradually gave way. I read her letter 3 times the day it arrived, and then I put it in my personal files and went back to work. I want to tell you what I have observed directly, because the survey records and the retired ranger's letter are historical, and someone will always find a way to explain history away. What I have seen with my own eyes is harder to dismiss, at least for me, at least in the hours after 2 in the morning when I am awake, and the explanations I reached for during the day feel thinner than they did in daylight. The markers move between surveys. I know this is what the records show, but I want to be specific about what it means in practice because the records make it sound like an administrative issue, and it is not an administrative issue when you are the one standing in front of a steel post that you personally installed and correctly surveyed ground 14 months ago, and the ground around it is undisturbed, and the post is now 4 meters inside the boundary. It was installed to mark. I have reinstalled boundary markers 22 times in 7 years, not moved them due to survey correction, reinstalled them because they were inside the line they were supposed to define, in ground that showed no evidence of the disturbance that would accompany any known mechanism of displacement. The first time this happened, I measured the displacement carefully and documented it and submitted it through proper channels. The second time I did the same. By the 5th time, I had accepted that the documentation was going into the survey file where it would join 40 years of identical documentation and nothing would change. I still document it. I document everything. But I no longer expect the documentation to produce answers. The second thing I have observed directly is what happens to the air at the boundary on still evenings in late spring. This is harder to describe precisely because it involves a sensory experience that does not translate cleanly into measurement. There is a quality to the air at the boundary margin on calm evenings when the wind has dropped and the thermal activity is at its daily low that I can only describe as a pressure differential that the instruments do not detect. Not temperature, the thermometer reads the same on both sides of the line, not humidity. Not any variable I have been able to isolate and quantify. Just a sensation consistent across dozens of observations over 7 years of standing at the edge of a volume of air that is somehow denser than the air you are standing in, as though the space inside the boundary has more in it than the space outside. I mentioned this once to another ranger who had worked the corridor before me. He was visiting the district for an unrelated reason, and we had dinner, and I brought it up carefully, framing it as a curious observation rather than a conclusion. He put down his fork and looked at me and said, like, "The air is full of something you cannot see." "Yes," I said, "exactly like that." He nodded slowly. He said he had felt it every time he worked that boundary for 4 years and had never found a way to write it in a report. He said he had decided eventually that it was a psychological response to working in an unusual environment, that the knowledge of what the ground was doing had primed him to perceive strangeness, and his perception had obliged. I asked him if he believed that explanation. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I believe it when I am somewhere else." He picked up his fork. "It is harder to believe when you are standing there. I am standing there regularly. I have been standing there for 7 years. I have had a long time to work through every reasonable explanation I can construct and measure each one against what I actually observe, and I want to be honest with you about where that process has left me. I do not think the corridor is expanding because of thermal substrate dynamics. I think thermal substrate dynamics is a phrase that was chosen because it is accurate enough to be defensible and vague enough to not require further explanation. I think the people who chose that phrase knew what they were not saying and made a decision that not saying it was easier than the alternative. I think something inside that boundary is growing. Not a geological process, not a measurable phenomenon in any framework I was given in school or in training or in any official document I have been handed in 7 years of working this posting. Something that does not have a name in the professional vocabulary I operate in, and that these survey records have been quietly documenting for half a century. in the only language available to people whose job requires them to measure things without being permitted to say what they think the measurements mean. I think it is old. I think it has been there longer than the park has existed, longer than the surveys, longer than the names we have given the land it sits beneath. I think it is getting larger at a rate that is slow enough to manage, and that someone at some level above the ones I have access to made a determination a long time ago that slow enough to manage was an acceptable situation, and that the management strategy was markers and survey files and closure signage and rangers who were never quite told enough to ask the right questions. I was not told enough to ask the right questions in my first year. By my third year, I was asking them. By my fifth year, I had accepted that the answers were not coming through any channel I had access to. So I do what the rangers before me did. I walk the boundary, I check the markers, I document the displacement. I reinstall the posts in their correct positions, knowing they will need reinstalling again in 14 months. And on still evenings in late spring, when the wind has dropped and the air at the boundary margin has that quality of density and fullness, I stand at the edge of whatever is inside and I feel it the way you feel, a large thing in a dark room, not by seeing it, by the space it takes up around you, by the way the air changes when you are close enough to where it ends and everything else begins. The boundary markers will be checked again next month. Some of them will be inside the line. I will measure the displacement and document the coordinates and reinstall the posts in correctly surveyed ground. And whatever is inside will continue doing what it has been doing for longer than any record I have found goes back, quietly, consistently, taking up more space.